The dust in Red Hollow carried more than dirt that spring of 1886. It carried silence heavy enough to choke a town that had learned to look away. People gathered near the trading post, not out of curiosity, but obligation, drawn by rumor and discomfort, the kind that settles in your gut when you know something wrong is about to happen and you decide not to stop it. Eliza Harper stood at the center of it all, her boots sinking into dry earth, her dress patched and faded, her hands folded so tightly her nails cut crescent moons into her palms. She was 23, though grief had already aged her beyond that, and today she belonged to no one, which somehow made her belong to everyone. Her uncle spoke for her because no one had ever asked if she wanted to speak for herself. He called her useful, quiet, steady, the way one might describe a mule or a plow. He said she worked hard, complained little, and asked for nothing. He did not say she had buried a husband at 19, or that her body had failed to give life afterward, only that she was no longer wanted where she came from. The crowd did not cheer. It did not protest either. Women stared at the ground as if it might open and swallow them whole. Men shifted their weight and pretended this was business, not cruelty. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the far edge of town where the land flattened into nothing, where escape looked like an idea instead of a promise. She had begged once before, long ago, when love still felt like something owed. She had learned that pleading only made the fall hurt more. So now she stood still, her silence louder than any scream, her shame burning beneath her skin like a fever that never broke. A man stepped forward when no one else would. He was tall, worn by sun and labor, his coat smelling of leather and pine resin. He did not smile. He did not inspect her. He reached into his pocket, set coin on the crate between them, and said nothing to the man selling her. The uncle squinted, uneasy, asked if the man understood what he was buying, asked if he knew there were no guarantees. The stranger answered without raising his voice. "She isn't broken," he said. And that was all. Eliza felt the shift before she understood it. The moment ended without ceremony. People drifted away, relieved it was over, relieved it wasn't them. Her uncle gave her a shove that carried years of resentment in it, and told her to go. She picked up the small bag at her feet, the only thing she owned, pressed into cloth and memory. A locket, a change of shoes. Nothing worth fighting over. She followed the man without asking his name because names had only ever hurt her. The wagon waited at the edge of town. Quiet, patient, the man offered her water without looking at her, as if kindness was not something to announce. The road opened wide before them, endless grass bending beneath the wind, the sky stretching like a held breath. They traveled in silence. Eliza studied his hands when the reins shifted, scarred and steady, hands that knew work but not cruelty. She wondered what kind of man buys a stranger without wanting to own her. When she finally asked why, her voice barely survived the wind. He answered simply, "5 children," he said. "No mother. I needed someone who wouldn't hurt them." The words settled heavier than any vow. The ranch appeared at dusk, tucked into dry hills that leaned toward the horizon. The house stood crooked but stubborn, the kind of place still standing because it refused to fall. Chickens scattered as the wagon rolled in. Life thin but persistent. Inside, 5 pairs of eyes watched her. 4 boys and 1 girl, all carrying grief they were too young to name. The man said her name like it mattered. Said she would be staying. No one asked for how long. That night, Elisa sat on the edge of a narrow bed and listened to a house learning her presence. Floorboards sighed. A child coughed. Wind pressed against the walls. She did not cry yet, but her hands shook like they remembered pain, even when her mind tried to forget. Morning arrived without permission. Smoke curled from the stove coffee burnet. Children moved like ghosts around her, unsure if she was permanent or temporary. She failed at breakfast, burned herself, dropped things, expected anger, and found none. When a pot shattered on the floor later that day, she froze, bracing for a voice that never came. The man cleaned the mess without blame and returned to work. Something loosened inside her chest, unfamiliar and dangerous. That night, she sat under the stars and cried quietly. Not from fear this time, but from the ache of something gentle pressing where pain had lived too long. She did not yet know its name. She only knew it felt like the beginning of something she had never been allowed to keep. The first night passed without ceremony. Only the low sound of wind pressing against the cabin walls and the uneven breathing of children who had learned to sleep lightly. Kate lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, counting every unfamiliar sound, bracing for a command that never came, for a hand on the door that never touched it. Morning arrived gray and hesitant, carrying the smell of smoke and weak coffee. Kate stepped into the kitchen, unsure where to stand, unsure where she was allowed to exist. 5 children watched her like startled birds, measuring her movements, listening for a wrong tone, deciding whether she would stay or vanish like others before. She tried to cook. The bread burned, the beans thickened into paste, the kettle slipped and kissed her skin with heat. She swallowed every reaction, every apology, every instinct to shrink. She had learned long ago that noise invited cruelty, and silence was safer. When the stew spilled across the floor that afternoon, the sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. The children froze. Kate did too. Her chest tightened as she waited for anger, for sharp words, for blame to fall heavy and familiar. Bio onlik nil. He wiped the floor with a rag, lifted the pot, and said nothing more than, "It's only food." Then he stepped back outside, leaving the quiet changed, leaving something unspoken standing where fear used to live. That night, Kate cried, without sound, on the porch, stars sharp above her, her hands shaking not from pain but from confusion. Kindness, when you've never been allowed it, can feel more dangerous than cruelty. Near dawn, the smallest girl burned with fever. Kate moved without asking, boiling herbs, cooling cloths, humming songs. Her mother once started, and never finished. She stayed awake while the night thinned and the child's breathing softened, and when morning came, exhaustion weighed less than relief. Bio watched from the doorway, saying nothing, but his shoulders eased as if something heavy had finally been set down. He left a note by her cup later, only 2 words, uneven and plain, but they settled deeper than praise ever could. Days folded into weeks. Kate learned the children's fears before they spoke them. One hated thunder. One went quiet when memories surfaced. One followed her footsteps, as if afraid she might dissolve if not watched closely. The first time a child called her mama, it slipped out, unplanned, fragile as breath. No one corrected it, not even her. The word stayed, taking root in the spaces where loneliness had lived too long. Bio asked one evening if she ever thought about leaving. She answered honestly that she once did. When he asked why, she hadn't. She looked toward the swing creaking in the dusk and said she was tired of surviving places that didn't want her whole. The town came back into her life without warning, wearing old faces and sharper tongues. Insults rose like dust, practiced and cruel, until Beau's voice cut through them steady and final, naming her not by what she lacked, but by what she gave. That night, danger arrived on unsteady feet and whiskey breath. Fear flashed old and familiar until it was broken by a single strike, by a man who stood between her and harm without hesitation, without explanation, as if there had never been another option. Later, as she cleaned his bleeding knuckles, she told him no one had ever defended her like that. He didn't answer, but the quiet between them changed shape, warmer, heavier, real. When one of the children was hurt badly weeks later, panic threatened to undo her, but her hands remembered how to hold, how to press, how to stay. The child survived, clinging to her voice, calling her mama again through pain and tears. That night, Bio told her she was free to go whenever she wished. Kate took his hand and said freedom wasn't leaving anymore. Freedom was being chosen again after being fully seen. Summer arrived, cruel and dry, testing the land and everyone on it. Crops failed. Water thinned. Hope narrowed. Still, Kate rose before dawn, fought the soil, sang 2 seeds that had no reason to live, and believed anyway. And when a single fruit finally pushed through the dead earth, imperfect and alive, Bio kissed her hand like a promise kept too long, understanding at last that some people don't need rain to grow, only a place where they are allowed to stay. The fruit never lasted long. They sliced it thin and shared it carefully, as if rushing might break the spell that had allowed it to exist at all. No one spoke while they ate. Even the children sensed it mattered more than hunger. Not long after, strangers arrived with polished boots and folded maps, talking about rail lines and opportunity. They promised money, schools, certainty. Bio listened without moving, his eyes drifting instead to the garden rows bent by Kate's hands, to the swing swaying gently where laughter had learned to return. When he refused them, there was no anger in his voice, only resolve. He said some land was already spoken for, not by papers, but by the lives it had chosen to hold. The men left confused, their plans folding back into ink and dust. Time did what it always does. The children grew, left, returned, left again. New footsteps filled the house, smaller ones, uncertain ones, carrying echoes of the past forward. The cabin aged, but it never emptied. Kate's garden spread wildly, refusing neat rows or permission. Things grew where they shouldn't have. Life bent around stones and fences and old scars in the soil, just as she had. Bio watched her every morning from the porch, never interrupting, never needing to. Love, he learned, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stayed. Years later, when his hands shook too much to carve straight lines, a grandson asked why the garden bore her name. Bio answered quietly that some people give birth without blood, and some places bloom only because someone chose to remain. When Kate passed, they laid her beneath the oak where the swing still hung, its rope silvered by time. Bio carved her marker himself. He didn't need many words. He never had. After that, he sat with her each dawn, sometimes speaking, sometimes only listening. And one morning, he didn't come back inside. They buried him beside her, the garden still breathing around them, stubborn and alive. Seasons moved on. Roads changed. Trains curved away from the ridge as if they, too, understood. Travelers still slowed when they passed the fence, reading the weathered sign nailed into old wood. It didn't promise profit or legacy or reward. It simply said the land was not for sale, because once someone was allowed to stay, and everything grew because of it. If this story touched your heart, like the video, share it with someone special, and subscribe to Lovely Soul Stories for more emotional journeys.